Hello, and welcome to Objective Health. I'm your host, Doug, and with me today is Elliot.
Hello.
So, we are just two bros doing a show today. Our usual ladies, are not with us, but they will be back. So, today we're going to be doing another episode of In the News, where we kind of look at the latest headlines in health. And lately, it's been kind of nothing but COVID. And a lot of ours are at least somewhat loosely related to the whole COVID fiasco. But we thought we would also take a look at some of the other stuff going on, because other health news doesn't stop just because there's a fake pandemic going on. So, to start things off, the Nutrition Coalition had an article up a couple of weeks ago, and it said members of USDA committee blow whistle on serious flaws in dietary guidelines process. So what the article covers basically is there were a whistleblower or several whistleblowers who are in on the dietary guidelines for Americans, who have basically been blowing the whistle on the whole operation, kind of saying that the whole process by which they go through and make recommendations on what will be recommended for the American people is very problematic, to say the least. Some of the stuff that they're saying is that there's a lack of time to finish scientific reviews. Reviews are deleted and added without public notice. There's lack of consistent standards across all the subcommittees. Lack of time for the USDA to adopt reforms mandated by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And that's an interesting one, actually, because not too long ago, I think it was maybe 2015, they mandated that they would have sort of like a peer review process by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Because they've basically been, beholden to no one for the whole time that they've been doing it. So they finally said, okay, we're going to get an outside group to kind of take a look at what we're doing and give recommendations and stuff. And now they're basically saying that, oh yeah, we don't have time to actually take any of those recommendations on board. They also say there's inconsistent evaluation of scientific evidence, exclusion of major bodies of evidence, including almost all the studies on weight loss and virtually all studies on low carbohydrate diets. And I mean, for us and anybody who is even moderately within the low carb community, you don't even have to say that. Anybody who kind of has realized the value of low carb diets recognizes that the dietary guidelines really don't reflect any of the research that's going on there. Because, I mean, there's studies coming out all the time that are showing the benefits of low carbohydrate eating regimens, and that is completely ignored in the dietary guidelines. They don't say anything like that. They're still saying, cut your fat, cut saturated fats, avoid meats, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's ironic. I think we were speaking about this a couple of months ago. Maybe, yeah, it's got to be a couple of months ago now. We did a show and we were discussing. It's interesting. Was it the leader or the head of the American Diabetes Association?
Yeah.
Actually came out and said that she herself follows a low carbohydrate or kind of ketogenic diet.
Mm-hmm.
Yet the International Association does not recommend those guidelines. In fact, many of the people who follow the guidelines set by these international massive institutions end up getting worse, or they certainly don't improve their health condition.
Yeah.
And so really anyone who has actually adopted or looked into alternative methods to improve their health has come across low carbohydrate or reduced carbohydrate diets, the importance of eating animal fats. I mean, the head of this coalition is Nina Takeolt. Is that how you pronounce her name?
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, she's authored a couple of books. The most well-known is The Big Fat Surprise. And, for years she's been lobbying and educating on the benefits of animal foods and how they have been demonized historically. And really, I mean, I think it's old news now. It's old news. It's something that we once knew and understood. And then there's been a lot of propaganda in the 21st century, the latter half of the 21st century, latter half of the 20th century. But now I think it's very much time to discard that. And anyone who looks into nutrition can see that. And it's kind of, it seems like it's a very long and drawn out process when it doesn't need to be.
Mm-hmm.
The coalition, actually on their website, they've got a pretty good overview of. They actually offer it for free, the report of exactly what is wrong with the science, and they also give some recommendations on how scientists or how the science can be improved. They're talking about things like enhancing transparency with the public. They're looking at finding ways to try to improve the results or improve the efficacy of the data that scientists or that trials are getting. They want to change the methods that scientists use. And they've got lots of kind of recommendations on how it can be done. I think one of the biggest problems that we're up against is private funding, is financial interests.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is probably the biggest issue that that these people who are lobbying for change are actually up against. Because we have to understand that there are major powers involved or who benefit from the current dietary guidelines. In fact, that's the reason that they're there.
Yeah.
And these kind of powers are the people who are above the law. They are above scientific transparency, so to speak. And they really, they really control things. So we're talking about the big multinational corporations, the big agriculture, even big pharma to some extent. There's many different, areas of money-making schemes kind of thing, which profit or benefit from people being in a state of chronic illness.
Mm-hmm.
So I think even though the science is rightly criticized, or the faulty science is rightly criticized, I think it's going to be difficult to make any major changes where we currently are. But that's just my opinion. It could just be
I think that's probably true. I mean, it might be cynical, but I think it's also fairly realistic. I mean, you have very entrenched bodies that are self-interested. And I mean, one of the things that really comes across in this whole whistleblower thing is that it seems like the actual committee for the dietary guidelines is like more of a formality than anything else. They're just kind of rushing through. There's lack of time to finish the scientific reviews. Reviews are added and deleted as like willy-nilly. There's no real consistent standards. It really seems like you're kind of on the board. They push a bunch of stuff at you and you kind of sign off on it, and there you go. You've got the dietary guidelines. And the decision making that goes on between for what actual science is looked at and what isn't, I would imagine, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine is very heavily influenced by who's given them money, right? And that's essentially the food processors. So if the science is pointing to low carbohydrate diets being good for health, for weight loss, for all these sorts of things, then the food processors who don't, processed food is like overwhelmingly not low carbohydrate diet friendly, right? It's loaded with sugar, loaded with carbs, all that kind of stuff. Then obviously they're not going to want to see that reflected in the dietary guidelines. They want people eating their food, their breakfast cereals, their chips, their snacks, their cakes, chocolate bars, all that kind of stuff. So it's not really surprising that that's essentially what you're seeing reflected in these guidelines. And they'll be politically correct about it, and they'll put limitations on things like, oh, only get whatever it is 10% of your calories from sugar or something like that. But realistically, it's like the food pyramid, or it's not a pyramid anymore, it's the MyPlate, does not reflect a healthy diet. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. No, it doesn't. And it doesn't take a nutritional scientist or a doctor to see that. It's fairly obvious. But it seems that this kind of problem is applicable to many aspects of science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially medicine, especially health. And as I was saying before, it's interesting because if you read scientific research papers published in the 1930s or 1940s, even the 1950s to some extent, you see how research scientists, research doctors, they seem very much open-minded about many things.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of off topic, but I've been doing a lot of research into the old studies that were done using high dose vitamins, for instance. And so there were doctors in the 1930s who were reporting excellent results from using very high doses of certain vitamins, which are dirt cheap essentially. They were using these for all kinds of conditions, one being, multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's, for instance. They were using them with excellent results. And then there comes a point in the scientific literature where you realize the research just completely drops off. It just disappears into these nutrients. And then actually, a lot of the research into pharmaceutical medications becomes more prominent. And that reflects this funding essentially when science was drawn away from actually finding out the truth toward how it can promote a narrative or provide evidence to sell a product or to act as a kind of evidence to support the selling of a product. In this case, it could be pharmaceuticals. In another case that we're talking about is selling a nutrient replete diet or depleted diet, which is highly profitable, but which actually, is causing, at least people in the Western world, but really internationally, it's causing people severe health problems.
Yeah, totally.
What
year? When was that you saw the change in the science? Like, was there like a year or a time period or something that you noticed that it started changing?
It's difficult to say.
Okay.
But it seems to be around the 40s and 50s, the 50s. Up until then, it was like, you have doctors who are reporting things which would be considered kind of heresy today, but yeah, I don't. Yeah, I'm not sure when financial interests started playing a larger role in scientific funding and things. But it was definitely around that time period that you saw science very much shift towards pharmaceutical-based medicine, and it was in the 50s when you had Ansel Keys coming out with his War Against Fat, right? So it kind of seemed to coincide with one another. It was almost like science was hijacked, or health science was hijacked anyway.
That's interesting. There was another article actually that relates to this by Jeff Volek. It was it's on The Hill. Nutrition policy must be at the center of the conversation. And he's essentially, he's not referring to any whistleblowers or anything like that, but he basically makes a very good point that, one of the things that's come up from this whole COVID thing is that it became readily apparent fairly early on that people who had underlying conditions were much more vulnerable to this virus. Especially people who had obesity, type 2 diabetes, and the like, metabolic syndrome, essentially. Yeah. And his argument is more or less like, come on, guys, like, let's do something about this. We have a significant amount of science that's showing us that if you are following a low carbohydrate diet, that all of those conditions are helped immensely by that. And yet our dietary guidelines are still pushing a diet that is high in carbohydrates. And it's like, the dietary guidelines are not reflecting the science. It's as simple as that. And when you combine that with the Nutrition Coalition article that's talking about what this whistleblower is saying, it's no wonder. It's like they're leaving huge chunks of the science out to essentially keep on putting out the same dietary guidelines every 5 years. It's like they're not really making significant changes. It's like there's a little bit of tweaks here and there and stuff. It's like, salt, we changed the amount of salt that you're allowed, which is kind of a nothing recommendation anyway. But realistically, overall, the thing, it's still it's still promoting the same foods over and over and over again. And things are just getting worse. He actually goes into, I think, unless it was a different article that I'm confusing it with, but he was going into, I think it's a different article that I was thinking about. But he does get into kind of how much obesity is costing the U.S. Yearly. Basically, it's nearly 150 billion for obesity-related medical costs and insurance and all those kinds of things. And diabetes is even worse. It's like 327 billion. So essentially it's a total shit show. It's, basically it's like we have this this knowledge that and anybody who knows anything about health recognizes that diet plays a huge role in health and whether or not you can get acute diseases. It's not necessarily just the chronic diseases like the diabetes, heart disease, all those sorts of things. But you're actually much more susceptible to acute diseases like COVID-19 if you aren't healthy, if you don't have an underlying baseline of health. And the dietary guidelines are not helping with that at all.
No, of course not. And it's like any other any other health condition, right? It's like, okay, so if your body is not healthy, it's so silly that this needs to be spelled out. It's so absolutely crazy that you have a guy having to write a very comprehensive article just to explain such a basic concept. If your body is not working as it should be because you're not feeding it the right things, then the way that the immune system, which is part of the body, it's not separate, it's part of the body, the way that the immune system works is fundamentally determined by your overall state of health. Mm-hmm. Your immune system uses things like nutrients to function properly. Now, if you do not have enough nutrients, then the immune system does not work properly. If you have chronic inflammation, then that will change the immune system. If you have metabolic problems, all of these things tie in together to essentially reduce your immune system. If you have a reduced immune system, you are more likely to get an infection and you're more likely to die of an infection. Mm-hmm. Simple. That's not a hard concept to understand. And I really don't think it's surprising in any way that the people who are susceptible to COVID are the people with multiple underlying health conditions, mm-hmm. one including metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, because these things fundamentally disrupt the immune system. How do you address that? Well, it's not by a vaccine, as we're going to see in a minute. That's certainly not the way that you address that.
Right.
And because that does not address the fundamental underlying cause, which is the faulty immune system.
Yeah.
It angers me sometimes.
Yeah. I can understand that. But and as obvious as it is to us, I do actually think that to your average person, it might not be so obvious. They don't necessarily make a connection between the fact that they're eating junk and they're getting sick more often. It's like, even when I talk to people who have nothing to do with health and don't understand health at all or something like that, it's like this concept isn't obvious to them. It's kind of like, when you say, they'll tie it to weight loss. It's kind of like what you're eating, that is directly related to your weight. Okay, they can understand that. But it's where kind of like when they say, oh yeah, I'm really run down, I'm getting every cold that's coming along, and you say, oh well, what's your diet like? They're kind of like, diet? What does that have to do with anything? Like it seems like it should be obvious, but I think that to the average person, maybe it's not.
I think society in general would do well if we had mandatory training on how the immune system works.
Mm.
You know, mandatory education in schools. This is how your immune system works, and this is how you improve your immune system.
Mm-hmm.
This is how you improve your health. Problem is, it ties back to what we were saying before, is that science was co-opted fundamentally. Medicine, health was taken away from a holistic view that what you put in your body and how you live your life affects your health, toward a pharmaceutical based view, which is basically characterized by the idea that if you have a certain health condition, you pop this pill for it, or you take this cream, or you have this nasal inhaler, nasal spray or something like that. You use a drug. You don't try to address the cause of why your body has that condition. You just take a drug.
Yeah.
So, in fact, yeah, I think you're right in that most people don't make the connection. But when you do eventually make the connection, it seems so obvious.
Yeah.
Because it actually kind of is. And it's something that we knew, or our ancestors knew for time immemorial. It's just we've been manipulated on a mass scale to lose faith in our bodies, lose faith in nature, right? In nature.
Yeah, it's true. Well,
talking about vaccines.
Yeah, speaking of vaccines. So
pharmaceutical companies.
What's that? Yeah, pharmaceutical companies. Let's go from the food processing companies to the pharmaceutical companies. So the New York State Bar Association, actually, Damien, maybe you can pull up this article. State Bar Association's Health Law Section report calls for mandatory COVID-19 vaccination, among other things. We're really just focusing on that. It's basically just an article, or more like a press release, actually, that was talking about, they put out some kind of report, the New York State Bar Association. And, some of the stuff they're talking about there is, allocating ventilators and personal protective equipment and all this other kind of stuff. Like, it's basically recommendations of things that they've learned from the pandemic, whatever you want to call it. But, snuck in there, of course, is the idea and encouragement for mandatory vaccinations. Once the vaccine comes out, everybody's got to get it. And this idea, it's. I mean, this is just the New York State Bar Association, but this idea is gaining global kind of acceptance, promotion. Everybody's basically talking about this. They've got everybody so scared that the second a vaccine is out, not only are they going to go get it, but they're going to go and insist that everybody else get it as well. Yeah. What do you think about that, Elliot?
I mean, where to start? It's it's disturbing. It's very disturbing because it's not just them calling for something like this. I mean, there's many. It seems to be on the cards, right? There's many kind of different sources who are pushing for a mandatory vaccine, who are pushing or who are kind of frothing at the mouth at the idea of a vaccine coming out shortly. It's dangerous because, well, there's lots of reasons why it's dangerous. First of all, is that it's not been done in history. If this is the first time that this will have been done, right? Mandatory vaccination for everyone. Are they talking? Would this include religious exemption, or would this be against religious exemption?
Yeah, well, there's a guy, a lawyer whose name escapes me right now, but he was a couple of months ago. Actually, not even. It was probably about a month ago. He put out a statement that said that religious exemption is nonsense and all these things are stupid. And if the American government has the right to stick a needle in your arm by gunpoint, which of course had the people freaking out about that statement. And it's interesting because all the people who are arguing for it always seem to bring up this case from 1905. The U.S. Supreme Court presented with Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which was a state-enforced smallpox vaccination. He was basically, I think he was a preacher or something like that, or a minister or something along those lines anyway. And he didn't want to get the smallpox vaccination, and they made him get it. Or no, sorry, they didn't make him get it. They made him pay a fine for not getting it, right? So anyway, the point is, it isn't really a precedent-setting case. This and it was back in 1905 for one thing. The Supreme Court, just because once they made somebody do it doesn't mean that, even though it's a precedent, it doesn't, they've been wrong before, right? So they always tend to bring up this case, even though it doesn't really relate. It was basically like, I don't want to get the vaccine. Okay, you have to pay a $5 fine, I don't know, every week or something like that. And he was like, fine. And that was it, right? So it isn't really like a precedent for mandatory vaccination. But they are basically stating that it is, and they do have the right to force vaccinations on people. Which is nonsense.
I mean, it's wrong on so many levels. You could look at it from multiple perspectives. One is the health perspective. So there are well-established vaccine side effects of almost every vaccine, right? Now, I'm pretty sure that the vaccination rate for any given, I don't know, vaccine, what is it? It's nowhere near 100%, right? I can't remember exactly what the percentage is, but for any given vaccine, I think the levels are somewhere like 50% or 40% even. It's like a lot less than you'd think it was for certain vaccines that aren't. You've got your standard vaccines that are given to young children, but then the adult vaccines, like the boosters and things, like
right,
a lot of people don't actually get those, right? But even with those, you get thousands of vaccine-related side effects. So people being injured by vaccines, right? So in terms of the health effects, well, the type of vaccines that they're looking at bringing in, mRNA vaccines. So the company who is really heavy into research at the moment, I think they're called Moderna. Is that right?
Yep.
Moderna.
Yep.
Now I think they've got a couple of trials running, but one of those is for an mRNA vaccine. Which is essentially, it's the first of its kind. Animal research has not been, has not shown good results, let's say. There's research, the type of vaccine that they're using, it's essentially genetic modification, right? So it contains messenger RNA, which is essentially, is very much the first of its kind and could potentially have lots of problems with that, right? There is no the vaccines haven't been, usually it takes like a couple of years to get a vaccine tested, because you have to go through multiple different processes of, you've got like the the petri dish data, you've got the animal data, you've got long-term trials that need to be tested. Then you've got human trials if those long-term animal trials have passed. And then you've got all of this other kind of safety testing just to kind of push a vaccine through. Now, a lot of the time there is corruption involved there, and there are vaccines which are pushed through which aren't safe. But, just assuming that the vaccine kind of that whole process is valid, then we would be waiting at least a year or a couple of years to get a good, to get a safe vaccine. Whereas these individuals who are pushing for this mandatory vaccination, it's almost like when you hear them speak or when you read their words, it's like they don't care about that stuff. It's like they want a vaccine and they want it now. And the problem is there is a great potential that this vaccine, if it is mandatory, then it's going to cause a lot of side effects and be highly detrimental to people's health, particularly the people who are already compromised. So if someone's healthy, then yeah, okay, they might not have a problem. But if we're looking at forced mandatory vaccination, that means that you're vaccinating a bunch of people who would ordinarily not be, might not be vaccinated because they are concerned for their health. So there's a large community of people who are interested in improving their health. People with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, Lyme disease, all of these different people who do their best to support their health in a variety of ways. They might take nutritional supplements. They might, follow special diets, and they've made very good progress. But these people are fundamentally susceptible to the effects of something like this kind of vaccine. If you mandate that, you are putting so many people at risk. And just on the health front, I think that it would be disastrous, personally. I think it would very much be disastrous. But there's also the fact that you're essentially, talk about medical tyranny, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Where is, it's meant to be a free country. You're meant to have free choice, right? In the USA. That sets a precedent, which, that could lead to a lot of, increasing controls further on down the line as well.
Well, it's a fundamental human rights issue, right? It's like anytime you're just saying like a mandated medical treatment is essentially stepping in and saying you do not have the right to decide how you want to take care of your health or do, whatever. You don't have the right to determine what medical procedures you undergo. Now, there are lots of instances, well, maybe not lots, but there are certainly a few instances where you can actually say, well, yeah, there are instances where people are subjected to medical treatments without their consent. One of them being water fluoridation, right? That is a medical treatment. And if you're just dumping fluoride into the water of a community, then that community they have not consented to that medical treatment. And the same thing could be said for, mandatory vaccination is the exact same thing, right? So fundamentally, it is an abridgment of people's rights as human beings to say, I have the right to freely determine what medical procedures I want to undergo. And it's so stupid just at the very fundamental level. It's kind of like if you are a vaccinated person and your vaccine works, like everybody says that it works, then how is me not being vaccinated a problem?
Yeah, that's what it comes down to.
Then they get into all this stuff about herd immunity and all that kind of stuff. But it's finally honestly, if there are vulnerable people in the population who can't get the vaccine, which is interesting because then that shows that there is potentially negative effects from the vaccine, which usually they deny completely. But if there's people who can't get the vaccine and they need to be protected from herd immunity, then you need to protect those people. That's the way I see it. That doesn't mean that I have to get your vaccination because somebody out there might be vulnerable. And by me not getting the vaccination, we're not going to reach herd immunity. Well, I have a different perspective on things. I think that I would rather reach natural herd immunity. I would rather be exposed to the virus in a natural setting and let my immune system deal with it. Anyway, I'm off on a bit of a tangent here, but.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's the most, we've spoken about this argument just so many times on this show before. I swear it's been,
it's true.
5 years kind of thing going over it. It's like, it's a very basic concept that if you have 5% of people who don't want the vaccine, then let it be up to them if they want to expose themselves to the potential of coming into contact with the virus. In fact, if the vaccine is said to work as well as they say it does, then those 95% should be safe. They're not going to get it. Because if the vaccine stops their body from getting the virus, then surely it's only the 5% who are going to be susceptible to the virus. And I'm pretty sure that us in the 5%, we'd be more than happy to face the virus rather than have the vaccine. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
But again, the authoritarians who are making these decisions, no, for those, it's almost like a threat, right? And it's potentially not even related to the fact that they believe or I would say they don't even necessarily need to believe that the vaccine is that essential. I think for many of the authoritarians in power, like, they just want to exert power and control over people.
Mm-hmm.
And to think that someone is not following their guidelines or someone is not doing as they're told, then they want to put people in their place.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that's what a lot of this comes down to as well. They want complete conformity. They're power hungry, many of them. And so, I think there's the medical argument if you do buy into the whole idea of vaccines, but it's almost like very much it's just another way to gradually strip away people's freedoms and implement more controls in as many ways as possible. And again, once you start accepting, or once you set that precedent for mandatory vaccination and people accept that, then who's to say that they cannot implement mandatory lobotomy for people who are, disagreeable in some way to the system, and then that's, we're probably familiar with Brave New World, this concept, this totalitarian regime in the future. Ultimately, when they can come into your house and strip you down and kind of lock you up in a cell and then insist that you take whatever medication that destroys your brain because you have a political opinion that is
incorrect.
That's incorrect. Yeah, exactly. So it's wrong on so many fronts. It really is.
And the funny thing is, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead, because I was going to speak about.
Well, I was just going to say, because you're talking about the authoritarians in power, and I think it's also the authoritarians just kind of in the general populace are threatened whenever you kind of are making a decision that goes against the decision that they've made. And I've noticed that, especially when, when I would talk about my diet to people who are not into the idea of changing their diet at all, they get kind of threatened by it. And, it's like, how is what I'm eating have anything to do with you? But they'll kind of start arguing and challenging you and being kind of put off by the fact that you I don't eat bread. It's kind of like, what do you mean you don't eat bread? And they'll get very kind of almost, in some cases, would kind of get hostile. And it's kind of like what I determined is that these people are basically just threatened because you have made a decision different from their decision, and that kind of forces them to question their own decision, or that it's somehow insulting to them because you're suggesting that they've made the wrong decision. And I think the same thing applies to the vaccine thing. It's kind of like, well, I've decided to blindly follow the authorities and get the vaccination, and why aren't you doing the same thing? That's a threat, because it's kind of like something that they don't want to have to question, and suddenly just by you existing, you are forcing them to question that decision.
Yeah, very much so. It's almost like it's such a threat to their worldview, and that it could shatter at any one given time, that they need to shut you out and shut you down so that they can continue with their nice, well-placed reality view of reality as everything fits together. I agree. I was just going to say on the topic of people responding negatively to a vaccine. There was just a bizarre story that came out. It was a couple of weeks ago. It was an article published on a website called Stat News. And it's really just bizarre. I mean, it was expected, right? Because they've been doing human trials for this COVID-19 vaccine. I think we did speak about it a couple of weeks ago when they announced it. But yeah, so they've been doing human trials. And out of I've lost exactly how many people were in the trial. It was a phase 1 clinical trial, and there was 45 people in the study. And out of the 45 people, it was identified that 4 participants experienced what is called a grade 3 adverse event. So a grade 3 adverse event is essentially a side effect that is severe enough to warrant immediate medical treatment. So it's not necessarily life-threatening, like immediately, but it does need immediate medical treatment. So this guy, that one of the guys who had this severe reaction to the vaccine, he'd actually given like an interview for a website. So he'd spoken about the vaccine. After he was given the vaccine, within 12 hours, he developed a fever of more than 103 degrees. Had to seek out medical attention. And so, yeah, he had been released. He'd gone to urgent care facility. He'd then been released, and he fainted when he got home as well. Apparently he recovered within a day, but it was a pretty severe side effect that he did get. And so he was giving this interview about having this side effect. And although it caused such a severe reaction in him, he still said that he supported the vaccine. He thought it was a great thing, and that he didn't regret having it.
Yeah. Even though he said it was the sickest he's ever been.
Yeah.
He said that he didn't regret it, and he hopes that his story doesn't dissuade other people from getting the vaccine. Yeah, I mean, 3 people out of a study of 45 means that you have a 1 in 15 chance of having a grade 3 reaction. You know, considering...
4 people. It was 4 people.
It was 4 people. 4 people, so it's even greater than that then.
It's like 1 in 12?
About that. So, considering the chances of you having an asymptomatic reaction to actual COVID is like 80% or something like that, I think I'll take my chances with the actual COVID. I don't need that vaccine. Thanks very much.
I mean, you know, the dangerous thing about this is that, I mean, the guy had such a severe reaction almost immediately. But that does not mean that there are not long-term side effects of this.
Exactly.
Right? The animal research, I don't have the statistics like right in my head, but RFK Jr. has spoken about the animal research done on these types of vaccines, showing that there was one trying to find a way to address the coronavirus in the past, a coronavirus vaccine. I think we've spoken about this one on the show. Is essentially showing that these mice, they developed immunity to the vaccine and there was no kind of immediate reactions. But then when they were exposed to the infection within, you know, like a couple weeks or something, when they were upon re-exposure, I mean, a large proportion of them died.
Yeah.
You know, I think all of them might have died.
Yeah.
So, you know, these animals were fine after having the vaccine. It was only when they were re-exposed to the virus that they had the side effects. So actually, you know, just because he's okay at the minute doesn't mean that he's going to be okay long term. I mean, he could develop all kinds of side effects. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
And considering someone in his age range, I mean, the guy, he can't be any more than 30, 35?
It says there, I think. Yeah,
he's
I think
29.
29. Yeah, I thought he was quite young. Yeah, 29.
I mean, the chances of him getting coronavirus and then the chances of him actually dying from coronavirus are so
minuscule.
Minuscule. So small. Why on earth would you put your body through that kind of vaccine to prevent against a virus which is practically non-existent in your age range? It's just bizarre.
I think that he's like a young idealist who has drunk the Kool-Aid. I mean, essentially, he sounds like a cult member, basically. You know, it's like one of those cult members who is in a cult and is like, they're doing obvious damage to the person, and yet they're still like, oh no, it's great. You know, it's great here. I love it. It's fantastic. You know, he has completely signed up for the whole narrative 100%. And he thinks that, you know, he probably thinks that he's doing good. You know what I mean? Like he's helping like humanity in some way. He thinks he's a hero. I mean, the guy's like super naive. What can you say?
Yeah, that's definitely a word for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
So,
anyway, I think, is there anything else to say about the... We talked a lot on both those topics. I mean, we did have a third thing to talk about today, but I think we are kind of running short on time. We're actually over our time. But I don't know, Elliot, did you have anything else to say about the COVID mandatory vaccination?
I won't be getting it.
Yeah, nor will I, especially if Bill Gates is behind it. People can go back and watch our Bill Gates show to see what I mean by that, if you actually don't know what I mean by that, but I don't trust that guy as far as I could throw him. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us. Be sure to like and subscribe if you are so inclined to do so. We will be back with another show next week, and we'll see you then. Thanks to Elliot and to Damien in the background, who I forgot to introduce. Damien's been with us the whole time.
Hello.
All right, guys. See you next time.
See you later.
See you next time.